In James chapter 1, James says, hey, God doesn't tempt you. And then in verse 14 it says, there's all temptation comes from our own evil desires, our own thoughts, our own wishes. And in verse 15 it says, when our desires are conceived, it leads to sin. In other words, when our desires, when there's still thoughts, when we put our thoughts into actions, it leads to sin. And then sin leads to death. You know, it reminds me in Genesis 4, right before Cain kills Abel, God tells them, be careful because sin is crouching at the door of your heart. In other words, you haven't sinned yet. You haven't killed your brother yet. But be careful because the route you're going, it leads to death. And I just want you to picture, to think about when we sin, when we think, when our sinful natures, when our thoughts are in place, hey, what are we going to do differently so that our thoughts do not translate into sin? In other words, how are we going to change our thought process so we don't sin?